Welcome to Debt Matters. Imagine taking out a personal loan to, I don't know, fix your car or maybe consolidate some credit cards. You make your payments every single month following the schedule perfectly, and then suddenly your lender just goes completely bankrupt.
Right, which, your first thought might be, well, maybe my debt is gone.
Exactly. But your debt absolutely does not disappear. Instead, you find out you actually owe this £250 million shadow entity, which is being quietly funded by one of the biggest banks in the country.
Yeah, it completely shatters that illusion of a one-to-one relationship between borrower and lender. We just sort of assume consumer finance is a straight line, but the reality is, well, it's much more intricate.
It really is. So we are looking at the June 2026 insolvency of Amplifi Capital, which was a London-based lender. And while a company going into administration is, a pretty standard business event, unpacking the exact machinery of this collapse reveals all these hidden, complex layers of modern consumer debt.
Oh, absolutely.
So our mission for you is to explore how consumer lending is financed behind the scenes, like far away from that slick interface on your mobile app. And we want to look at what actually happens to your obligations when the institution that issued your loan just, collapses.
Because to understand why this matters to the broader banking sector and, to borrowers themselves, we really must first trace the timeline of Amplifi's rise and fall. Like understanding how a lender actually reaches the point of insolvency dictates everything that happens to the loan book afterward.
Okay, let's unpack this. Amplifi started its operations in 2013, and they were entirely focused on serving credit unions, right?
Right, yeah. It was a very stable, low margin, community-focused environment, very predictable.
But then, by 2022, they executed this massive strategic pivot. They launched a direct-to-consumer brand called Reevo, offering unsecured personal loans with interest rates ranging from 23% to, wait for it, 50%.
Yeah, 50%. That is a fundamental departure from their original model. I mean, moving from credit unions to near-prime or subprime direct lending, it just changes the entire operational calculus.
It's basically like a restaurant moving away from its reliable everyday menu to focus exclusively on this high-risk, high-reward specialty, only to completely lose its footing.
That's a great way to look at it. You are chasing higher yields, absolutely, but you are also dealing with vastly higher default rates, and that requires completely different underwriting algorithms, far more aggressive capital reserves, and honestly, a much heavier infrastructure for arrears management.
Right, because you cannot run a 50% APR lending business with the exact same back office setup as your friendly local credit union.
No, you really can't. It's a totally different beast.
And the financials show that this pivot cost them dearly. By March 2024, Amplifi's accounts show a stark drop from a £5.5 million profit the previous year all the way down to a £100,000 loss.
It's just a staggering drop.
Right. What exactly breaks inside the machine to cause a £5.6 million swing in just 12 months?
Well, the auditors pointed to a combination of internal structural failure and external regulatory pressure. Internally, their foundational credit union operations really weakened.
The reliable stuff started failing.
Exactly. They had essentially relied on that steady, predictable cash flow to fund their highly aggressive expansion into the high-rate consumer market. So when that foundation cracked, they lost their primary safety net, which exposed the immense cost of running the Reevo brand.
And externally, you have those July 2023 regulatory changes. In the UK, we saw these sweeping new requirements for consumer credit firms.
Yeah, and this was not just some simple box-ticking compliance exercise, it required a fundamental systemic review of their practices.
Because when you are charging 23 to 50% interest, you are inherently dealing with a demographic operating right on the absolute edge of financial viability.
Precisely. And adapting to those new rules takes immense capital. I mean, you have to build new monitoring software, you've got to hire more specialized compliance staff, and drastically increase the time spent on customer service calls just to prove you are monitoring borrower outcomes.
So the operational drag of implementing those requirements essentially wiped out their margins.
Yeah, pretty much. Regulators basically mandated that lenders prove their products offer fair value and, do not trap borrowers in endless cycles of debt. Proving that operationally is highly expensive.
So you have a shrinking core business on one side and this increasingly expensive high-rate venture on the other.
Right. It's a perfect storm.
Which brings us to the core mystery here. If Amplifi is bleeding cash and reporting losses by early 2024, How are they still originating these high-rate loans? I mean, they need fresh capital to lend to new consumers.
They do, and this is exactly where a major high street bank, NatWest, enters the picture.
But NatWest didn't just hand them a loan, right?
No, definitely not. NatWest provided the capital, but not through a direct corporate loan to Amplify because, you know, if a massive bank simply handed cash to a struggling subprime lender, it would attract immense scrutiny.
Right. Regulators would be all over that.
Exactly. Instead, Amplify utilized a special purpose vehicle, or SPV, named Castor Financing.
Okay, so to give a mental image here, it's like a financial layer cake or a nesting doll, where you have these layers of corporate structure separating the original borrower from the ultimate source of the money. Amplify originates the consumer loan under the Reevo brand and then immediately sells that loan to Castor Financing.
Right, the SPV.
And then Castor issues loan notes to NatWest to fund the purchase. Let's just pause here and really look at this structure. If NatWest knows these are 50% interest loans to borrowers who are heavily squeezed by economic conditions, aren't they just outsourcing the risk?
That is the big question, yeah.
Like, how is an SPV not just a massive legal loophole for a high street bank to wash its hands of subprime lending?
Structurally, it functions exactly like a firewall in a physical building. NatWest builds this financial firewall. If Amplify catches fire and burns to the ground, which, they eventually did, the fire cannot legally cross over into NatWest's main corporate structure.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, the bank is completely shielded from the direct operational liability and the reputational heat of being the public face of 50% interest loans. Yet, through the SPV, NatWest still gets all the heat and energy from the furnace to power their own yields.
So it is purely a mechanism of isolation. The SPV, Castor Financing, is a legally distinct entity that just exists solely to hold those loans.
Exactly. And this is driven heavily by capital adequacy rules.
How so?
Well, if NatWest held unsecured subprime consumer debt directly on its balance sheet, banking regulations would require them to hold a massive amount of reserve capital against those risky loans, just sitting there doing nothing.
Just in case people default.
Right. But by funding an SPV, NatWest is technically just holding a structured corporate loan to a distinct, separate entity. It requires way less reserve capital, maximizing their efficiency while keeping the actual dirty work at arm's length.
Yeah, the scale of this furnace was massive. We have the numbers here. In September 2023, they set up what is called a securitization warehouse.
A huge one. Yeah.
And by March 2025, filings show the Class A facility alone had grown to 250 million pounds. We need to break down those terms because they really reveal exactly how the money moves. Let's start with the warehouse.
Okay, so a securitization warehouse is not a static holding pen. It is a revolving credit facility. Think of it as a massive rotating conveyor belt.
Okay, I can picture that.
Amplify originates a batch of loans, places them on the conveyor belt, the warehouse, and then draws down cash from NatWest to fund the very next batch of lending.
And the consumer loans themselves act as the collateral.
Exactly. As borrowers make their monthly payments, that cash just flows straight through the warehouse to pay the interest owed to NatWest.
So it constantly churns. New loans go in, cash comes out to fund more loans, and borrower repayments service the overarching debt.
That's the exact mechanism.
But you mentioned earlier that filings showed the Class A facility reached 250 million. Why specify Class A?
Because in these securitization structures, risk is deliberately sliced into tiers or tranches. The Class A facility represents the senior debt.
Meaning what, exactly?
It means if the portfolio starts taking losses, like if the borrowers who took out those 50% loans start defaulting, the Class A note holders like NatWest are the absolute last to lose a penny.
So there are junior tranches sitting below them to take the hit first.
Exactly. The junior tranches, which are often held by the originator like Amplify or maybe specialized distressed debt investors, they absorb the first wave of defaults. They act as a buffer.
So NatWest isn't just protected by the corporate firewall of the SPV, they are structurally insulated from the initial credit losses by the tranche mechanics.
Precisely. They have a £250 million exposure, but it is heavily, heavily insulated.
Still, it begs a massive question about systemic visibility. Does this indirect method obscure the true level of high-risk consumer credit exposure actually sitting on the balance sheets of regulated banks?
I mean, that is the exact vulnerability financial regulators are constantly trying to map. Because when you look at NatWest's top-level financials, you just see a senior loan to a corporate SPV. You do not see a portfolio of 50% unsecured consumer debt.
The risk profile looks entirely different on paper.
Exactly. It is a brilliant mechanism of isolation, but it relies entirely on the original lender, Amplify, actively managing those loans, collecting the payments, and, feeding the conveyor belt.
Right, and when the originator enters insolvency, that isolation gets tested violently.
It really does.
So let's look at what happens when that firewall is tested, specifically from the ground level. We know Amplify enters insolvency in June 2026. The company essentially collapses. So what does this all mean for the person actually holding the loan?
Well, the practical reality, which frankly often shocks consumers, is that a corporate insolvency does not erase the debt.
It doesn't just vanish into thin air.
No, not at all. The legal contract you signed remains fully enforceable. The money was borrowed, the capital was deployed, and your obligation to repay stands regardless of the originator's corporate status.
Even though the company that issued the agreement literally cannot function anymore. Like, they have no staff, no operational capacity, just an administrator trying to clean up the mess.
Correct. The physical company might be gone, but the asset, which is your legal promise to pay, still exists. What changes is the entity controlling that asset.
So someone else steps in.
Exactly. The loan portfolio might be managed directly by the administrator, or it might be handed over to a third-party servicing company, or it might even be sold entirely to a debt purchaser who buys the book right out of the insolvency process.
But how does the administration process actually govern this? Because the administrator steps in, and their primary legal duty is to recover funds for the creditors. They need to get that £250 million back up the chain to NatWest and the other note holders.
Right, that is their mandate.
But how do they balance the ruthless mathematics of creditor recovery with the regulatory duty to support vulnerable customers? Because the very nature of a 50% interest loan means the borrower is likely operating with very little financial margin to begin with.
Yeah, and that tension dictates the entire strategy of a consumer credit insolvency. Administrators are officers of the court. While they absolutely must realize assets for the creditors, they inherit the regulatory framework attached to those specific loans.
So the rules travel with the debt.
The rules travel with the debt. An administrator cannot simply demand immediate repayment in full from everyone or deploy aggressive, rule-breaking collection tactics just because the original company failed.
So they are bound by the exact same rule book Amplify was supposed to follow.
Absolutely. Whoever ends up collecting the debt must adhere to the original consumer protection rules. They are required to investigate any outstanding disputes the borrower had with the original lender.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work for an administrator.
It is. They also must offer forbearance, like affordable repayment plans or payment holidays, for those in financial difficulty. If an administrator or a subsequent debt buyer fails to do this, they actively erode the value of the loan book.
Because regulatory breaches can render the debts legally unenforceable.
Precisely.
So the administrator is essentially boxed in. They desperately want to maximize the cash return for NatWest and the junior creditors, but to keep the loans legally valid and collectible, they had to spend massive amounts of time and resources offering forbearance, managing disputes, and treating customers fairly.
It is a highly delicate balancing act, and, it creates an incredibly disorienting environment for the borrower.
I can imagine.
Think about it. Imagine taking out a loan with Reevo and suddenly a completely different corporate entity, perhaps a debt purchaser you have never even heard of, is demanding your money and controlling your credit file?
Which honestly opens a massive window for fraud. Corporate failures just create chaos, making borrowers prime targets.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because if I am a borrower and I am already confused about who actually owns my debt because I saw a headline about Amplify going under, I am highly vulnerable to a scam.
This is a critical, practical reality of the insolvency space. Scammers actively monitor insolvency registers and news feeds.
They know exactly who to target.
Yes. They will deploy highly sophisticated phishing campaigns, sending text messages or emails claiming to be the new administrator or the new debt purchaser.
And they look official. Right.
Very official. They will construct a narrative that your account has been migrated, and they will instruct you to update your direct debit to a new account number immediately to avoid late fees.
And if you fall for it, your monthly payment goes straight to a criminal, but you still legally owe the real administrator.
Exactly.
So your actual account falls into arrears while you think you were doing exactly what you were told. That is terrifying.
It really is. The golden rule during any corporate failure is that borrowers must continue following their valid original payment instructions until they receive verified official notice of a change.
So you don't just stop paying.
You do not just stop paying, and you certainly do not redirect your payments based on an unsolicited email. You must always verify any unexpected requests through official regulatory registers or by contacting the administrators through known published channels before altering your bank details.
Right. So the burden of vigilance really falls on the consumer when the corporate structure breaks down. Let's trace the entire lifespan of this collapse to see the full picture here. A debt originates with Amplifi, targeting higher-risk borrowers under the Reevo brand at 50% interest.
Right.
And then that loan is immediately moved across a legal firewall into a special-purpose vehicle, Castor Financing.
Where it is then bundled into a revolving securitization warehouse serving as collateral.
Exactly. And it is funded by a major institution like NatWest, who sits safely insulated in a Class A senior tranche, avoiding the direct capital requirements of holding subprime debt.
Yeah, they stay clean.
Then, squeezed by operational costs and strict regulatory changes, the originator fails. The whole structure shutters, leaving court-appointed administrators to untangle the mess, trying to extract value for the banking giant without breaking the rigid consumer protection rules that travel with the loans.
That sums it up perfectly. The absolute necessity in this ecosystem is accurate record-keeping and responsible oversight when these massive portfolios transfer hands.
Because things can get lost in the shuffle.
Exactly. A new owner might buy the debt out of insolvency. They might change the name on the collection letter, and they might change the bank account receiving the payment, but they cannot strip away the borrower's regulatory protections. The infrastructure of the loan survives the death of the lender.
It really reveals a sprawling, hidden ecosystem beneath every standard loan agreement. We always think of a loan as a simple handshake between two parties, but it is actually a highly engineered financial product flowing through multiple corporate entities.
It's basically an assembly line.
So I will leave you with this final thought to ponder. As these special-purpose vehicles and warehouse facilities increasingly bundle high-interest loans into structured financial products, who else is ultimately buying into them?
That is the real question.
It is entirely possible that the 50% interest loan your neighbor took out to fix their car is, right now, quietly generating the yield inside your own retirement pension fund.